and cream, designed to draw the eye upwards. These tiles are for decoration, but are also a great example of fireproofing, something that's super important to the city of Chicago, but I'll talk more about that later. These tiles can withstand fire, but are so delicate that they need to be hand washed with soap and water. Straight ahead, it's the second tallest building in the city of Chicago, and it's wearing a name tag. That's Trump International Hotel and Tower. It's from 2009, from renowned architect Adrian Smith. Adrian Smith season, The Bear. If anybody who's a fan of that show, features a lot of great Chicago restaurants and scenery. So it's always really fun to watch that show. Alrighty, once we cross out from under this bridge, we have on your right the iconic pair of corncob towers. They're called Marina City. You might recognize them from a postcard, or maybe as the cover art for the Wilco album Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. These are our corncob towers, Marina City. This is from Bertrand Goldberg in the 1960s. When these were put up, they were the first post-war high-rise residential complex in the United States. And they're seen as a catalyst for the residential building boom that swept through the downtown area. When these were put up, there was no Lou Malnati's Pizza down the street, no Magnificent Mile shopping. In fact, there was little to no infrastructure down here for residential living. But Goldberg wanted to change that. He wanted to attract people to the city center the way they do in European cities where he had studied. So he constructed this vertical, self-sufficient, corncob-like utopia. It's a city within a city. Inside, you can find restaurants, shopping, a grocery store, a movie theater, a bowling alley, a gym. Talk about amenities. My favorite part is the 18 floors of parking, valet only, which valet seems like it's for the best. I once hit a parked car at the airport parking garage, so this is my high-stakes parking nightmare. Car's only ever gone over the edge and into the river twice. Once was for a stunt for the Steve McQueen movie The Hunter, and the second was for a very creative car insurance commercial. We're gonna jump over to the other side, and on your left, you're gonna see a beautiful glass tower topped with what looks like a Greek temple. This is another awesome line in Chicago's architectural conversation. This is how old I was when I hit that parked car. So we all have our own unique gifts. We're gonna jump to the other side for the Reed Murdoch on your right. Most closely resembles the prairie style of architecture due to its warm brick facade and flat horizontal shape. This is currently the headquarters for Encyclopedia Britannica, in case anybody was wondering what those guys were still up to. This building's asymmetrical. There's one less bay of windows to the left side of the clock tower. Count them if you don't believe me. It's because the city widened LaSalle Street in the 1930s. This building was in the way, so their solution was to chop off a whole bay of windows and drive me crazy 100 years later. We're gonna jump on over to the other side. On your left, we have a great example of Chicago being in conversation with itself. This is the Builder's Building. About 2/3 of the way in, there's a vertical black stripe of windows. To the left of the stripe is the original section of the building from 1927. On the right is the newer section built in 1987. The architect of the newer section honored the original intentions of that first architect. In this way, the Builder's Building is a beautiful blend of old and new. We're now about to cross underneath the Wells Street Bridge. Notice the intricately detailed lamps and handrails. This bridge is an exact replica of the original Wells Street Bridge, which stood for over 90 years. This bridge is from 2013. This building on your right is so large that up until 2008, it had its own zip code. Occupying 2 city blocks, Merchandise Mart was originally a wholesale warehouse and trade show space from Marshall Field & Co. It's from 1930. It's a beautiful example of Art Deco style. 3 key features of Art Deco include inset windows, which give the building a sense of verticality, repeating patterns and polished limestone. Marshall Field & Co. had to let go of the building during the Great Depression, and it was purchased by Joseph Kennedy, father of future U.S. President JFK. And in 1953, he added the sculpture busts that line the riverside to honor the merchant princes of Chicago, like Marshall Field, Montgomery Ward, Frank Woolworth, and more. We are now headed into Wolf Point. Wolf Point is the meeting spot of all the branches of the Chicago River. It's also a newer spot on the river for construction. Most of these buildings were not here a decade ago. For example, we have on your right, Salesforce Tower, a commercial office building from 2023. It's part of a trio of new buildings built on land leased by the Kennedy. Red sculpture by Santiago Calatrava is River Point. It's the building with the double parabolas. The bottom parabola and the slanted angle helps keep the building out of the way of active train lines beneath the plaza. But that bottom arch also works as a rain gutter, something they need today. That striking red sculpture out front is called Constellations by Santiago Calatrava. The curve of the building is an imitation of the curve of the river, and the glass matches the sky. It doesn't match the river, I'm sorry. But the curve is the same curve shared with the New Bean building, which I'm going to talk about later. We are now turning down the north branch of the Chicago River. And in the north branch is where we're going to find the oldest building we have got on this tour. It is that red brick structure just ahead. That building is called Fulton House, and it is from 1898. Fulton House spent most of its life as a cold storage facility, an occupation it held for over 70 years. It was essentially a big old 16-floor refrigerator and freezer. So, Chicago was known as the hog butcher for the world. They would bring barges of meat from the cattle stockyards on the south side, offload them into this freezer here, where they would then be loaded on to refrigerated train cars and shipped all over the country. In the 1970s, when the meat packing business went away, Fulton House was purchased by Harry. The North Branch has been made much more desirable. It's why we can go from buildings like this, the East Bank Club, a high-end fitness club designed to face away from the river, to being able to sell $2.2 million cottages, or even have buildings like these, the Kinsey Park townhomes, which boast river views and have sidewalks and gardening to really highlight the river rather than hide from it. Alrighty, our captain is going to turn this boat for some more architecture down the South Branch. I'm going to hop off the mic for a few minutes, grab a little sip of water, but I will be right back. Please visit restroom or bar downstairs if you like. If the rain, the drizzling is bothering you, I promise my feelings will not be hurt. If you want to go sit underneath on the bottom deck, there are speakers down there so you can still hear me. No problem. But I'm going to hop off the mic really quick. Thank you. Is in Chicago city limits. As we pass by, you're going to notice inside, towards the back, there's a concrete slab that works as the counterweight to create that seesaw effect. Carroll Avenue Bridge retired from being a bridge in 1999, and it has been enjoying its free time, but still lowers once a year just to prove it still can. It was designated a Chicago landmark in 2007. We're headed back into Wolf Point, and on your right, we have the aptly named Riverbend building from 2002. It shares the same radius of the curve with River Point, and the New Bean building, which I'm going to talk about now. It's going to be on your left. It has a little name tag in the top right corner. I love this building for its alternating blue-green glass reflecting the sky and river. I'm sure you noticed our river is green. And that is not because it's dirty, although sometimes it is. It's actually because of all the green algae we have. If you want to see it really green, come back during St. Patrick's Day when we dye the river a fluorescent shade of green using a natural dye. It lasts for about 3 days and is actually pretty fun. But back to the Nuveen, great example of contextualism with the shape and color reflecting the river. The building's from 1983, but it made its movie debut in '85, starring in Ferris Bueller's Day Off as Ferris Bueller's dad's office. Alrighty, coming up, we have this contemporary blue glass building. Blow it over. Well, the answer is one of 3 anti-sway techniques. It's called inertial slosh dampers, this very first one we're going to talk about. We got 3 on this tour today. But this first one, inertial slosh dampers, at the top floor of the building, there is 160,000 gallons of water in 12 tanks. When the wind sways the building one way, the water in the tank sloshes the other way to counteract it. It works as like a giant shock absorber. Kind of similar to when you get out of the bathtub and water sloshes back and forth before settling. So rounding out some of our newer construction, we have on your left, Bank of America Tower. It's from 2020. Took 3 years to build and cost about $800 million. Their solution to that 30-foot setback restriction is a tripod setup that launches the 3rd floor into the air. You know, as someone who has banked at Bank of America previously, I like to think this is my building too. In a way, I did help pay for it, so kind of like an investor. The Sphinx, because people in the 1920s were obsessed with Egyptology. You can see the 2 paws. The attitude in the 1920s is exactly like your attitude in your 20s. Just a lot of, we're so beautiful and nothing bad will ever happen to us. And then in walks financial ruin, probably, spoiling all your fun. Art Deco really only lasted the second half of the 1920s. Once the Great Depression started, construction on new buildings halted. Then with World War II and all its devastation, Art Deco, with its flashy, optimistic ornamentation, became a representation of a bygone time, a symbol of what once was. Chicago and the rest of the world had to take some time to really process and recover from a Second World War. And it wasn't until the late 50s and early 60s that architecture started to return. It was a cautious dip your toes in the water kind of return, but modernism was born. We have a German transplant to thank for that. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe introduced Chicago to his black box modernism style, which is on display in these 2 buildings here. Gateway Center 1 from 1965 and Gateway Center 2 from 1967. You'll find no fun ornamentation on either of these buildings, for their design is simple and functional and most importantly, frugal. But with this cautious optimism returning in architecture, the 1970s were ready to push the boundaries even further. The 1970s said, we see your black box modernism style and think we can do better. We raise you white boxes. And they really did. That is Gateway Center 3. It's our example of international style. Concrete and stone to really lighten things up. The boxes could be white, gray, brown. The options are endlessly neutral. It's called international style because the idea was that you could find this building anywhere in the world and it would still make sense. You probably have a building like this in your nearest city. By the time we hit the 1980s, we actually do get a bit bolder and funkier in our design. Gateway Center 4 from 1983 is our transition into postmodernism and contextualism. It's whimsical, while still finding ways to incorporate itself into its environment. The curve of the building is an imitation of the upcoming curve of the river, and the glass matches the river's color. And As for the whimsy, all of the glass on the building is bubble glass, meaning that the center of each pane bubbles out. This makes reflections on the building look like reflections on the water's surface. So make sure to give it a little look-see as we travel on by. So, that is roughly our 100 Years of Architecture tour within a tour. And in it, you can see how the architecture in Chicago has responded to what was going on in the world and how cultural attitudes can influence design. Well, the culture can also impact a building's purpose, as we will see with this next building. This giant Art Deco style building just ahead, that is the old Chicago Post Office. Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck, which made Chicago the mail order capital of the world, hence the massive post office. However, as the world changed and digitized and shopping habits evolved, we really didn't need a massive post office anymore, and it closed its doors in 1996. And it didn't reopen until 2019 after a $500 million renovation, and it is now home to a number of company offices and headquarters like Uber, Walgreens, and PepsiCo. So, that is our great big post office. Former post office. We like to go big or go home, you know? I like to say Chicago is a city of greats, great food, great sports, great architecture. And as we near the origin site of a not so little fire that toppled the towns, Chicago is a city of great disasters. I'm talking about the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. We're now entering story time, so buckle up. I promise to return to architecture soon. But let me paint the scene of the Great Chicago Fire. It's the evening of October 8th, 1871, and Mrs. O'Leary is milking her cow Daisy before turning in for the night. Some hours later, a neighbor alerts Mrs. O'Leary to a fire in her barn. This fire quickly spread north and east into the heart of Chicago's business district, where it burned for over 24 hours until the morning of October 10th. When rainfall, along with firefighters' efforts, were finally able to extinguish the inferno. 17,000 buildings were destroyed, and 1 in 3 Chicago residents were left homeless. A really dark part of that story, that's already pretty dark, is that people thought they could escape the flames by jumping into the river. I don't know if you remember when I said it was an industrial waste dumping ground, saying that Daisy somehow must have kicked over a lantern that set the barn ablaze. Chicago was even dubbed the City a Cow Kicked Over. However, the journalist who first blamed Mrs. O'Leary admitted on his deathbed that he made it up. But not before Mrs. O'Leary spent the rest of her life tied to the fire that had leveled so much of Chicago. It wasn't until 1997 that the city of Chicago officially exonerated Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. But at that point, it was a little late to clear up Daisy's public image. And published an op-ed saying that we were full of hot air, blowing smoke, telling long-winded stories, etc., etc. So it actually has nothing to do with the weather. We just happened to also be windy. But we won the bid, and the 1893 World's Fair was a beautiful debut of the city of Chicago to the rest of the world. 27 million people from 46 countries came through the fair's turnstiles in those 6 months. Daniel Burnham was the architect placed in charge of the World's Fair. I'll talk more about him later. And Jackson Park, where it was held, some items we love debuted for the very first time, like shredded wheat, Cracker Jack, PBR, the L Train, the Zipper, Wrigley Gum, the dishwasher, and the Ferris wheel. Ferris wheel is perhaps the coolest debut, designed by George Ferris. Carried 2,100 passengers in 36 cars the size of buses, carrying about 60 people in each. But I'm scared of heights, So my favorite debut item was the brownie. Mrs. Bertha Palmer of Palmer House Hotel fame instructed her chefs to create a cake that was dense enough for fairgoers to eat as they walked about the grounds, and thus my favorite food was born. Our cat was only completed in 2016, but Burnham knew the importance of a public recreational spot way before the river was cleaned up. He anticipated the Magnificent Mile shopping district and planned for Navy Pier long before it took shape. He is responsible for kicking off the City Beautiful movement, which has inspired so many cities in their urban design. Daniel Burnham. All right, we're gonna jump back into architecture. If this one on your right looks familiar to you, it's because it should. It's the same architect and same idea as Marina City, those corncob towers. This one here is called River City. It's from Bertrand Goldberg in 1986. In a way, Goldberg was a social scientist in addition to being an architect. He believed that the residential complex should be a place for community, and that is reflected in his very unique designs. On the other side of River City, we have a newer building on this tour. This is the Reed. It's from 2023. It's a 41-floor luxury residential high-rise with a rooftop garden. It's part of a larger 7-acre master plan to develop along the South Branch of the Chicago River in the South Loop neighborhood. South Loop neighborhood is one of the many distinct and beautiful neighborhoods we've got here in Chicago. There's a lot more on the Lake Michigan side of things, but this side is really starting to grow. So if you come back in the next few years, there may be a ton of new buildings down here. But over on the Lake Michigan side of the South Loop neighborhood is where you're gonna find the museum campus, which features the Adler Planetarium, the Field Museum, and the Shed Aquarium. Quick show of hands, anybody gone over there and checked out any of those fun spots? Yeah, Lago has a long history with grain commodities and agriculture, and that little lady oversees it. She famously has no face. There are a ton of rumors as to why that is, but the real reason has to do with the style in which she's designed. Much like the Oscars statue, it's more about the iconic figure than a detailed face. Also famously, that building served as Wayne Enterprises in Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. Clearly a trilogy of movies I care deeply about. I love movies set in Chicago, especially when they feature buildings I get to see every single day. Feels like seeing a celebrity on the street. I know that that building has met Christian Bale, so in a way, so have I. All right, we're coming up on Chicago architectural royalty. Up first is the Queen, this pink Texas granite building with the glowing crown up top. That's 311 South Wacker. The glowing crown up top was originally lit with over 1,800 fluorescent bulbs. But the light... My favorite fact about the L train is that for $2.50, you can take one of those bad boys all the way to the airport. I'll never pay another $70 Uber again. All right, back to the river. So the city of Chicago, that's why we call 55 West Wacker the Danny DeVito. It's just a little guy and his two supermodels. 55 West Wacker is our resident short king. To the left of our short king is the Leo Burnett building. It's from 1989. It's noted for its unique black and gray pixelated coloring. Leo Burnett Worldwide, advertising agency responsible for many brand mascots we know and love. Like the Pillsbury Doughboy, Keebler Elves, Tony the Tiger, and the antagonist of a recurring nightmare of mine, the Jolly Green Giant. Rips the roof off my childhood home. It's probably why I don't eat vegetables. Hosted a design competition looking for the most beautiful office building in the world. And out of 263 entries, this French Gothic revivalist style from New York architects Raymond Hood and John Mead Howells won. This building is modeled after the Rouen Cathedral in France, a building often painted by Monet, whose work you can catch at the Art Institute of Chicago, just a couple of blocks down Michigan. The building is a steel frame covered in Indiana limestone, And embedded into the exterior of the building are fragments from a